The desert burned like an open wound, the kind that never healed, only deepened with every mile. The sun had no mercy. It tore the sky apart and left the land gasping beneath it. Isabel Alvarez ran barefoot through that endless furnace, the earth cutting her feet raw, her breath scraping her lungs like fire. Every heartbeat pounded against her ribs, fighting to stay alive one more second. Behind her, hooves thundered, a brutal reminder that death was not far. She didn't dare look back. The sound alone told her enough. The men following her wore badges that once meant justice, but now they gleamed like mockery under the dying light. Their horses cried, their guns cracked through the wind, and their shouts came like laughter. She had been running for 2 days. 2 days without rest, water, or hope. The desert had eaten her name, her fear, and nearly her faith. When her knees finally buckled, she crashed into the dirt, skin tearing open against gravel and dry thorns. Blood streaked her calves where the cactus had claimed her. Her mouth tasted of copper and dust. She tried to stand again, but the ground tilted beneath her. Each breath came sharper, thinner, until she thought her lungs might split. The horizon shimmered in cruel mirages. And then, through the haze, she saw it. A ranch, fences leaning with age, a wooden table half broken beside an old barn. No sign of people, no shouts, no soldiers, only the drone of flies and the whisper of wind. She dragged herself toward it, one hand clawing at the dust, her vision swimming between sky and earth. Her stomach screamed louder than her voice, her mind pleading for one moment of stillness. When she reached the shade beneath that broken table, her body surrendered. She collapsed, her fingers clutching the splintered wood like it was the last thing keeping her tethered to the living world. She thought maybe this was it. Maybe dying here in the quiet was better than being dragged back by men who smiled while they killed. Then she heard the boots. Not the rush of pursuit, just slow, steady steps crunching over dry ground. They carried. No threat in sound, but the silence that followed them chilled her all the same. Isabel lifted her head and saw a man standing a few feet away. Broad shoulders, sunburned skin, a face carved from years of work and solitude. In one hand he held an axe, the blade still wet from chopping wood. He didn't look like a soldier, but there was danger in his stillness, the kind born not from malice, but from surviving too long in a place where kindness dies first. He stepped closer. She tried to crawl back, but her body betrayed her. Fear swelled inside her chest until it cracked through her voice, a broken whisper begging the world to be gentle, just this once. The man froze mid-step. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, searched her face as if her pain had spoken louder than words. The air thickened with heat, sweat, and something else, something faintly human. Pity, maybe, or recognition. He lowered his hand, turned without a word, and disappeared into the barn. For a long moment Isabel lay still, waiting for the strike that never came. Then, footsteps again, returning. A canteen dropped into the dust beside her. The man didn't speak, he didn't stay. He just turned away and walked back into shadow. The metal of the canteen was hot under her fingers, but when she lifted it, it felt like mercy. She drank in shaking gulps, water spilling down her chin, soaking into the dirt. Each drop felt like borrowed time. From somewhere behind the barn came the creak of a wooden gate, the restless sound of a horse. He was still there, somewhere close. Watching, perhaps guarding. She couldn't tell which frightened her more. When the world dimmed again, she whispered into the silence, her voice almost gone. She wanted to know who he was, and why he hadn't turned away when he saw her bleeding in his dust. The desert didn't answer, only the wind. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had softened to gold. The air inside the barn was thick with the smell of hay, wood, and quiet safety. For the first time in days, no one was chasing her, yet peace felt like another trap. Beautiful, but uncertain. She sat up, her body screaming with each small movement. The canteen still lay beside her, half empty. He hadn't taken it back. Through the open door, she saw him working by the fence. Each movement of his hands was deliberate, steady, like a man who no longer owed anything to time. When he noticed her watching, he gave a small nod. No words, no smile, just acknowledgement. That quiet respect confused her more than any threat could have. Her stomach growled loud enough to startle the horse tied nearby. She might have laughed if she remembered how. Instead, she stayed silent, afraid that any sound might break whatever fragile truce this was. The man disappeared into the barn again, then returned with a piece of bread and a tin cup. He placed them near her feet and walked away. She stared at the food, suspicion and hunger fighting inside her. When she finally took a bite, the bread was dry but tasted real, like something meant for the living. Hours passed. The heat softened. The quiet settled deeper. She began to wonder if maybe he wouldn't ask her name at all. No questions, no conditions, just stillness. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft, like a thought escaping by mistake. She reminded him he could have turned her in, could have traded her fear for favor. He looked at her, expression unreadable, and said nothing for a while. When he did, the words were plain and heavy. He hadn't done it because she hadn't asked for help. She had only needed a place to stop running. The truth of that cut her deeper than any wound. The sky turned red as the sun bled over the horizon. Isabel's eyes drifted toward the open desert, where freedom shimmered like a mirage. 2 steps toward it, and she saw it, an old rifle hanging on the wall, clean, loaded maybe. For a moment she froze, wondering if this kindness was just another trap dressed in quiet manners. The man noticed her stare. His voice was calm, almost tired. She could take it if she needed to, shoot him if that made her feel safe. No one had ever given her that kind of power before. Her throat tightened. She turned away. She didn't want to shoot anyone. He shrugged, and the silence between them said everything. That night, she lay in the hay, staring through the cracks in the wall at a silver moon. Each gust of wind made her flinch, waiting for footsteps, waiting for the past to catch her scent again. But all she heard was the steady breathing of the man sitting outside keeping watch over someone he didn't know. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like prey. The desert sighed in its sleep. Somewhere the stars began to turn. Morning crept in slow, spilling light across the land, like it was afraid to wake the dead. The desert looked softer then, almost forgiving. But beauty in this country always came with teeth. Henry poured coffee into a tin cup, the steam twisting in the cold air, rising like ghosts that refused to move on. Isabel sat near the barn wall, her back straight despite the ache in her bones. Her eyes were swollen from another sleepless night, but there was something new in them, something between suspicion and fragile calm. He set the cup down beside her, then turned to his tools again. No words, no questions. Just the scrape of metal against wood, the small sounds of a man who built his peace one routine at a time. She lifted the cup and whispered thanks so faint it barely reached him. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but she could feel that he'd heard. When she stepped outside, sunlight caught her face. For a single heartbeat, she forgot what fear felt like. Then she saw them, 3 men on horseback waiting by the fence line. Their horses shifted, tails flicking, the men's eyes sharp and full of malice disguised as curiosity. They weren't soldiers, just townsfolk, the kind who carried more hate than sense. One of them spat into the dust, words sliding out of his mouth like venom, mocking the old rancher's choice of company. The others snickered, eyes raking over Isabel with the kind of hunger that made her stomach twist. Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stillness in him was more dangerous than any weapon. He just stared until the men's laughter died, until their horses turned and carried them off in uneasy silence. Yet the air they left behind felt poisoned, heavy with things not spoken. Isabel's fists clenched. She could still feel the sting of their words, the burn of being seen as something less than human. "They hate me," she murmured to the empty air, but Henry was already walking back toward the barn. He didn't deny it. He only said they hated what they couldn't understand. She let out a small laugh, hollow and tired. Then they must hate almost everything. For the first time, a faint smile ghosted across his face before it vanished again into the dust. By noon, the sound of boots on dry wood broke the quiet. Sheriff Dwayne rode in all shine and smugness, boots too clean, hat too white, and a face too used to power. He leaned on the porch rail like he owned the land beneath him. The law had made him lazy, not righteous. Word had spread. He'd heard Henry had company, a pretty one too. Henry's jaw worked as the sheriff's gaze drifted toward Isabel. The man's tone carried a false charm, but there was something darker underneath. He reminded Henry that the law didn't take kindly to strangers, especially those without papers or names. Henry's voice came low, steady as stone. The law also said a man's home was his own. The air thickened. The sheriff smirked, tapping dust off his hat brim, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a noose. He told Henry not to let this one ruin him, then turned and rode off with the slow confidence of a man who believed threats were just another form of conversation. The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. It filled every crack in the barn, every breath they took. Isabel didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her. But the fear that had lived in her chest since the chase began started to twist into something else. Something like belonging. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, Isabel sat on the porch steps. The horizon bled orange and red until the world looked aflame. She watched it in silence, the weight of the day pressing against her shoulders. Behind her, Henry's steps were slow, measured, the sound of someone used to being alone. "They won't stop," she whispered to the dying light. His voice came soft, certain. "Neither will you." A small smile touched her lips, the first one that didn't break her face. Something unspoken passed between them, too delicate to name. Not love, not yet, but a quiet understanding born from shared solitude. The kind that doesn't need words or promises, the kind that only the desert can keep alive. Night came fast that day, the kind that made even the stars feel lonely. The air smelled like rain that would never fall. Henry sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, not out of fear, but habit. Some habits were prayers disguised as preparation. Inside the barn, Isabel stitched a torn sleeve under the trembling light of a lantern. Every flicker of the flame threw shadows across her face, reminders of things she'd rather forget. Outside, the night grew restless. Horses stirred. Gravel shifted beneath unseen boots. Henry stopped moving. He counted the steps in his head. 3 men, maybe 4. Too sure-footed for travelers, too quiet for drunkards. The door creaked open. A voice spilled through the dark, thick with liquor and cruelty. "Well, now look what the old man's hiding." It was one of the men from the fence. The smell of whiskey hit before his laughter did. The others followed, faces twisted in that familiar mix of boredom and hate. Henry stood, the knife still in his hand. He told them to leave his land. They stepped closer, boots crunching like dry bones. One sneered that Henry didn't own the girl, that she was worth something to the right kind of people. Before Henry could move, Isabel stepped out of the barn. Her hands trembled around the old rifle, but her eyes didn't. They were sharp, alive, filled with something fierce that hadn't existed in her before. She told them she wasn't for sale. The man's grin widened. He reached out and grabbed her arm. A second later, the rifle's butt slammed across his face. The crack of bone echoed in the dark. Blood splattered the dirt. The man stumbled back, cursing, and the others surged forward. Henry moved first. The knife flashed, caught one man across the jaw. Fists flew, dust rose. Isabel screamed, fired a warning shot into the air. The explosion shattered the quiet like thunder. Horses panicked, kicking up dust and fear. The men fell back, dragging their wounded friend, spitting threats that vanished into the night. They didn't retreat out of mercy, but because the noise had drawn the town's attention. Silence returned, jagged and heavy. Henry leaned against the fence, blood streaking his temple, the knife still clutched in his hand. Isabel dropped the rifle and ran to him, her voice cracked, barely holding. She wanted to know why he had fought for her, why he had risked everything when he didn't even know her name. He looked at her for a long time before answering, because he was tired of watching good people bleed for no reason at all. The words broke something inside her, something brittle that had kept her heart locked shut. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of gunpowder and the first hint of rain. They stood there in half-light, two broken souls with nothing left to lose except each other. Trust began to take root that night, deep and stubborn, like a seed dropped in the harshest soil. But the desert is never done testing those who survive it. And somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen eyes watched, waiting. The night wasn't finished with them yet. Morning rose slow and gold after a night that had stolen too much sleep. The desert wore its silence like a shroud, as if even the land wanted to forget what had happened. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of rain that never fell. The wind carried ashes of last night's fear, scattering them across the dry earth where blood had darkened the dust. Henry stood on the porch, his left arm bandaged in a strip of torn cloth. His face was pale under the morning sun, eyes drawn toward the horizon like he expected it to bring trouble again. He had lived long enough to know peace rarely lasted in a place like this. Behind him, Isabel stepped into the light carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. The sight of her felt like a quiet miracle. Barefoot, bruised, her hair tangled from sleep, but standing, alive. She handed him a cup without a word, her fingers brushing his only for a heartbeat before she turned her gaze toward the sunrise. For a long while they said nothing. They just watched the light crawl over the desert, painting everything in gold that wouldn't last. Henry finally spoke, voice rough from smoke and silence. She could leave today if she wanted. The road was clear. No more pursuers, no more gunmen, at least not for now. Isabel didn't answer. She watched the line where the sky touched the earth, that endless stretch of emptiness that promised freedom but hid danger behind every dune. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. She'd spent her whole life running, from men, from pain, from herself. And for the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to stop. She looked down at her hands, scarred, trembling, but her own, and whispered that maybe she'd run far enough. Henry turned to her, his expression unreadable, and told her she could stay if she wanted. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation, something simple, something quiet, something that might finally heal the parts of her that had forgotten how. Days passed in slow rhythm after that. The kind of quiet that didn't ask for trust but built it anyway. Isabel helped mend fences and fetch water from the well. She learned to saddle the horses, to oil the tools, to find peace in repetition. The ranch began to feel less like a stranger's refuge and more like a heartbeat she could hear in her sleep. Sometimes, when the wind was soft and the sun slipped behind the hills, Henry caught her smiling at nothing. The kind of smile people wear when they realize the world hasn't completely turned against them. The people in town still whispered. When Henry rode in for supplies, the stares followed him like shadows. Some pitied him, others mocked, but all of them feared what they didn't understand. A man protecting a woman the world had already condemned. He ignored them. He'd spent years learning that silence was stronger than any argument. Isabel didn't ask what they said. She didn't need to. She could feel their judgment every time the wind shifted, carrying voices from the distance. Yet with each day the noise mattered less. The walls of the barn, the rhythm of chores, the sound of Henry's boots on the porch, they were enough to drown it all out. One evening, while the sky glowed like dying embers, Isabel stood by the fence watching the horses graze. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of sage. Henry joined her, his movements slow, deliberate. She could feel his presence before she saw him. He asked if she missed wherever she came from. The question hung between them like a fragile thread. She thought about it for a long time before answering. Home wasn't a place, she said, it was a memory. And memories fade, even the painful ones. He nodded. He understood that kind of forgetting. Weeks turned to months. The land changed colors, the sky deepened, and life began to settle into something close to peace. They worked side by side, sometimes talking, often not. Words weren't needed when the silence already spoke of survival. But the desert never truly forgot. It waited, patient as time itself. One afternoon, Henry rode out to check the far fence line. Isabel stayed behind to tend the horses. When she turned, she noticed something glinting near the barn door, a brass button, dull and half buried in dust. She picked it up, her stomach turning cold. The insignia stamped on it was unmistakable, a lawman's badge. Her breath caught. She looked toward the ridge, scanning the empty horizon, half expecting to see them again. But the world was still, cruelly still, the kind of quiet that hides danger. When Henry returned near dusk, his horse sweating and eyes narrowed, he already knew. He didn't ask how she found it. He only told her the truth straight. Someone had been watching the ranch. The sheriff, maybe. Or worse, the color drained from her face. The past had a way of finding people who wanted to start over. That night, they kept the lamps low and the rifle close. Henry sat on the porch, the same way he had that first night. But this time his hand never left the gun at his side. Isabel stayed inside, staring at the shadows that slid along the walls. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind sounded like footsteps. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. The memory of the men who hunted her felt too near, as if the desert had carried their ghosts here. At some point near dawn, she walked out quietly and found him still there, eyes on the horizon. She stood beside him without speaking. The first light of morning touched their faces, painting the scars they both carried. Henry finally broke the silence. Trouble was coming, and they both knew it. The badge in her hand was proof, but this time neither of them would run. Isabel looked at him, realizing how much had changed since the day she collapsed at his gate. She wasn't a fugitive anymore, not really. She was someone worth standing beside, someone worth fighting for. He turned to her, his gaze steady as the dawn. He said that fear was just another kind of chain, and chains once broken shouldn't be worn again. She nodded. For the first time, she believed it. As the sun lifted, she walked back toward the barn and began to pack supplies. Quiet, methodical, ready. Henry saddled the horses. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The desert, vast and indifferent, watched them move like two small figures in an ocean of light. It didn't care who was right or who was hunted. It only swallowed stories whole. But some stories, the strong ones, leave their marks even on stone, and theirs was beginning to carve deep. By the time the next sunset came, the air had changed. The quiet no longer felt like peace, it felt like warning. The desert had a way of holding its breath before trouble arrived. Isabel could feel it in her bones, the same way animals sense a storm before the sky darkens. The wind carried dust instead of scent, and the birds had stopped calling. Henry knew it too. He didn't speak of it, but his movements grew tighter, quicker, every action sharpened by old instincts. He'd seen this kind of calm before, back when men came with torches instead of mercy. He spent the morning repairing the barn door, though it didn't need fixing. Isabel watched him, her heart restless, the found badge still hidden under her pillow like a curse she couldn't throw away. When night fell, she sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup gone cold. She asked Henry what he thought would happen if they came again. Not the drunks from the fence this time, but the kind who didn't laugh. The kind who wore law-like armor. He stared into the fire for a long while before answering. He said the law in these parts didn't care about truth. It only cared about ownership. Who belonged and who didn't, and to them she didn't. Isabel's stomach turned at the thought. She'd crossed miles of desert, fled bullets and ghosts, just to find herself cornered again by the same world that wouldn't let her exist without a man's permission. Henry reached for the coffee pot, refilling his cup, and told her the story of the last time the sheriff had come for someone he knew. A friend, a man accused of stealing cattle that weren't his. They'd found his body 2 days later hanging from a cottonwood tree. No trial, no chance, just an example. By the end of the story, the fire had burned down to embers. The silence that followed was heavy enough to break. Neither of them slept that night. At dawn, hoofbeats stirred the stillness. Distant at first, then clearer, heavier. Isabel rose from her cot, heart pounding, hands shaking as she reached for the rifle hanging by the door. Henry was already outside, waiting. The sun wasn't up yet, but its first pale light stretched across the ground, outlining the shapes of riders moving toward the ranch. Sheriff Duane led them, 4 men in all, each armed, each carrying the same self-righteous certainty that only power gives. Henry stood at the gate, unarmed. The sheriff stopped his horse a few feet away, eyes scanning the barn. His smile was slow, practiced, venom wrapped in charm. He told Henry he was harboring a fugitive, a woman wanted in 3 counties. Said the law had caught up at last, and that maybe it was time Henry stopped pretending he didn't know who she was. Isabel stood in the doorway, the rifle lowered but not forgotten. The men's eyes snapped toward her like wolves scenting blood. Henry's voice came steady. He told them she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd been hurt, hunted, and left to die in a desert that had already claimed too many souls. The sheriff laughed. He called it a fine story for a lonely old man with too much sympathy. Then he told his men to search the barn. Henry didn't move. His voice dropped, quiet but sharp. This was his land, his home, and no lawman with clean boots and dirty hands was going to tear it apart. The sheriff dismounted, hand resting on his holster. For a moment the world seemed to hold still. The wind stopped, even the horses went silent. Then a gun cocked. One of the deputies raised his weapon toward Isabel. Henry's eyes darkened. He stepped in front of her, his voice a low growl that could have come from the desert itself. The deputy hesitated. Even the sheriff seemed unsure for the first time. But pride is a dangerous thing. It doesn't let men back down easy. He told Henry to move aside. Henry didn't. The shot came without warning. The sound cracked through the air like a lightning strike, echoing across the valley. Isabel screamed, dropped to her knees. Henry staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood blooming through his shirt. The sheriff's men froze, shocked at their own violence. Isabel lifted the rifle. Her arms trembled, but her aim didn't. The sheriff shouted, telling her to stand down. The world blurred into chaos, dust rising, horses rearing, the smell of gunpowder thick and choking. Isabel's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear her own breath. Henry's voice came from behind her, weak but calm, telling her to stop. To not let them make her like them. Tears burned her eyes. The rifle's barrel wavered, then slowly lowered. The sheriff holstered his gun, pretending control he no longer had. He ordered his men to leave, not out of mercy but fear. No one wanted blood on their hands this far from town, not with a witness, not with a legend in the making. When the dust settled, only Henry and Isabel remained. He was bleeding bad but alive. She tore her skirt, pressed the fabric against his wound, her hands shaking but sure. He met her eyes, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through the pain. Told her he'd had worse. Told her he'd survived this too, but she knew it wasn't just the wound that hurt, it was what came with it. The price of defiance, the cost of standing still when the world demanded you bow. That night, rain finally came. Not much, just enough to darken the soil and cool the air. Isabel sat beside him on the porch as he dozed, his breath shallow but steady. The rifle rested across her knees, the sound of rain soft against the roof. She didn't cry. The tears had burned out long ago. What she felt now was something colder, stronger. Resolve. The sheriff would come again. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But when he did, she wouldn't be the frightened woman crawling through the desert. She wouldn't be the hunted. She'd be ready. The storm rolled across the plains, distant lightning flashing like old ghosts. Henry stirred in his sleep, muttering something she couldn't catch. She looked at him, the man who had risked everything for a stranger, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not safety. Not love. Something older. Faith. Faith that maybe, just maybe, kindness could outlast cruelty. That 2 broken souls could still build something sacred in the ashes of all that pain. And as the thunder rolled far beyond the ridge, Isabel whispered into the dark that she'd never run again. Not from law, not from fear, not from her past, because this time she had something worth standing for, and she intended to keep it. Morning came slow and silver, the kind of dawn that feels like an apology. The rain had passed, leaving the earth cool and breathing again. The air smelled of wet dust and juniper, soft enough to almost forget the night before. Isabel sat on the porch steps, her hair damp, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside her, Henry dozed in a chair, his bandaged shoulder rising and falling with each steady breath. For the first time in days, the sky looked clean. The storm had washed away the blood from the yard, but not the memory of it. That would take longer, maybe forever. The desert doesn't forgive easily, it only gives you time to keep walking. When Henry stirred awake, Isabel handed him a cup of coffee. The faintest smile tugged at his mouth, one corner lifting like the start of a sunrise. He took it with his good hand, nodding once. No words needed. They both knew what had been lost and what had been kept. The land stretched quiet before them. No riders on the horizon, no dust clouds, no threats for the moment. Just the slow hum of insects and the sigh of the wind through grass that had finally remembered how to live. Henry told her she didn't have to stay, that she'd done enough, earned her peace, and could leave when she was ready. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted toward the open plain, endless and golden. It was the same road she had taken when she fled for her life, but it no longer looked like freedom. It looked like forgetting, and she'd had enough of that. She told him softly that maybe she'd stop running, that maybe the world wasn't finished teaching her how to stand still. He watched her for a moment, then smiled, that quiet, tired smile of his. Told her to stay if she meant it. Stay and help mend what the world kept breaking. That was how it began. Not with promises, not with love declared under stars, but with two people deciding that survival didn't have to be lonely. Days turned into weeks. The wound on Henry's shoulder healed slower than he liked, but Isabel refused to let him work before it did. She took over the chores, fed the horses, even fixed the fence that had split during the storm. Her hands toughened, her back ached, and her heart found a rhythm in the stillness. Sometimes she caught him watching her while she worked, half amused, half proud, the kind of look that spoke louder than words. At night they'd sit by the fire, not talking much, just sharing the same quiet space like they'd been doing it for years. The town whispered, of course. It always did. Some said the rancher had lost his mind, others said he'd found redemption. Isabel didn't care. She'd spent too long living for other people's mercy to start now. But something strange happened as the weeks went by. The whispers started to fade. Folks who once crossed the street when Henry rode into town began nodding instead. The blacksmith offered him a new horseshoe at half price. The storekeeper stopped pretending Isabel wasn't there. It wasn't kindness, it was respect, born from fear of a story that had begun to spread. They called her the girl who faced the law and stayed standing. Some said she was cursed, others that she'd been blessed by the desert itself. Either way, the town learned to leave her be. One evening, as the light sank low and the wind carried the smell of mesquite smoke, Isabel stood by the corral watching the horses. Henry joined her, a small bundle wrapped in cloth under his arm. He handed it to her without explanation. Inside lay a small revolver. Old but clean, polished until the metal caught the last light of day. He told her it had belonged to his father, a man who believed that protection wasn't about killing, but about never being afraid to stand your ground. She turned the gun in her hands, feeling its weight, its history. Then she nodded, eyes steady. She understood. From that day on, she wore it on her belt when she rode into town beside him. Not as a weapon, but as a statement. They built a life slowly, like two people repairing something neither had made but both had inherited. The ranch came alive again. Horses stronger, fences straighter, the soil taking to seed like it hadn't in years. Isabel began tending a small garden near the barn. The first bloom came that spring, a patch of wild daisies bright against the dust. Henry watched her plant them, his voice low when he finally spoke. Said he never thought flowers could live out here. She smiled. Maybe they just needed someone stubborn enough to stay. When summer came, the sky turned cruel again, but the land held its breath differently this time. The storms still came, but they passed quicker. The ghosts that had haunted the edges of her dreams began to fade. One night, As the cicadas sang and the stars burned wide over the desert, Isabel asked him if he ever regretted helping her. Henry didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, then shook his head slowly, said regret was for men who still had something to lose. She smiled, half amused, half aching, asked what he'd meant by that. He looked at her for a long moment, then said she'd saved him too, only she didn't know it yet. The words hung between them, quiet but true. The fire cracked, the night deepened, and the world outside seemed smaller for a while. Weeks turned to months, months into seasons. The wrench grew stronger. The scars on Henry's shoulder faded, and the ones inside Isabel began to heal too. Sometimes she still woke from dreams where the sound of hooves chased her across the dark. But when she did, she'd hear the steady breathing from the porch and remember she wasn't running anymore. The desert had changed her, and in its own cruel way it had saved her. Years later, people still talked about the rancher and the woman who came from nowhere. Some said they were lovers, others said they were ghosts. But those who passed by at dusk swore they saw two figures sitting side by side on the porch, silent, watching the sun die into gold. And maybe that's what mercy looks like in the end. Not forgiveness, not salvation, but two souls choosing to stay when everything else tells them to go, because love in the wild doesn't roar or plead. It just endures, it stays. So if you're still here listening beneath this desert sky, maybe take a moment to think about it. When was the last time you slowed down long enough to see someone who needed a little kindness? Out here in the wild, it only takes one act of mercy to change a whole life, maybe even save one. If Isabel and Henry's story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wild West Romance, where every story reminds us that even in a world made of dust and sorrow, there's always room for love to grow. Now pour yourself another cup of coffee, or maybe a little whiskey if that's your style, and let the desert keep your secrets a while longer. Because mercy, my friend, always leaves its mark.